not to bury the lead here, but what was your connection to the AIDS quilt?
I started the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt in 1987. I had the idea in 1985. Was very moved by the death of my best friend Marvin Feldman from Providence, Rhode Island, and I felt at that point that all of my friends were going to die, and I was going to die, and we would all be forgotten. And of my circle of friends, believe me, I was the least interesting. Had my friends lived, they would be taking home Pulitzers as well as Emmys and Oscars. They would be serving in Congress and in state houses. They would be mayors. Many of them were great artists, poets, screenwriters, filmmakers, and I was just so distressed by this reality that they were all disappearing, and I wanted them to be remembered. And I also wanted to try to break through the statistics. The statistics can really numb your mind, and I wanted to reveal something of the humanity behind these statistics. So the quilt, with all of these individually created tributes to these people who passed away, I think was a big part of changing the hearts and minds of the American people.
How many segments in the quilt today?
You know, it's hard to say how many quilt panels there are because there are quilts now all over the world. We think of quilting as such a particularly American folk art, but there are similar traditions on every continent. So I would say in the US there's probably about 85,000 to 100,000 panels. Worldwide, I don't know, but even with that large a number, of course, that still represents just a tiny fraction of the total number of people who were killed by this disease. And I think it's still important to point out that the overwhelming majority of the people who have died of AIDS were not gay men. They were heterosexual men and women and their children. And that still gets lost in this stigma of HIV/AIDS as a particularly gay issue.
When's the last time it was displayed in its entirety, or near entirety?
The last display of the entire quilt was in 1996 when it covered the entire National Mall. If your viewers can visualize the mall from the steps of the Capitol to the Washington Monument, we covered that entire expanse with fabric.
Where's it stored today?
It lives in Atlanta, and the Names Project Foundation, which runs it, is just opening a new visitor center for people to see it in Atlanta, Georgia.
How did it end up in Atlanta?
The board made the decision that they wanted to be closer to the Centers for Disease Control and also to the civil rights leadership. And it was also at a time when the demographics of the epidemic were beginning to change profoundly in this country. So today we see that the places where we see an increase in transmission are mostly in the South, particularly Atlanta. It's ironic that those states that have taken the most conservative and repressive approach to dealing with HIV/AIDS, the most negligent approach in my view, are now the places with the highest infection rates, particularly among young African American men.
Here's the cover of the book, When We Rise, My Life in the Movement. Where is this picture taken from?
That picture is me on the stage of the San Francisco Gay Pride celebration, though then it was still called Gay Freedom Day in 1979.